Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the City Convention Centre on the 12th floor at City Flinders campus. And of course, welcome to Rotunda in the West Conversations with Australian Writers. And what a galaxy of writers we have tonight. Never been done before. 7 great writers all in the one room at the one time. Tonight's event is entitled My Enduring Love Affair with Writing.
When I was a teenager, I went to romantic comedies with my mum. We sat side by side in the cinema in the dark, and I was consumed with longing for the moment when the hero finally overcame all obstacles and drew the heroine into an ardent embrace. But all through this yearning, I felt sick with worry and pity for my mother. I thought, this is all over for her. She's married my dad. Robert Redford is never going to ask her to walk with him barefoot in the park. She will never drink a highball with Cary Grant or have breakfast at Tiffany's. She will never have a farm in Africa. I imagined her despair. I was mortified for her and sorry. She must be hating this reminder of her middle-agedness. And now, here I am. Half a century has skulked past. I have been married to the same art form for 30 years. You writing virgins, writing girlfriends, writing brides, flushed with the newness of it, the euphoria of it. You are wondering, is she still in love? Is her prose, sexy? One afternoon at the Elstonwick Classic, my mother gave me 4 pieces of advice. The first is, learn to like beer. Don't be an expensive date. Boys should not be expected to fork out their hard-earned money on fluffy ducks. She's quite right. Number 2, never complain about your period. Everyone has them. What makes you so special? Number 3, when you leave home, the first thing you must do is develop a relationship with a butcher. But the 4th piece of advice, and the only one related to the topic at hand, is this. To be successful in love, one must work at it. You have to put your shoulder to the wheel with marriage and labour. At my cousin's wedding that same year at the Melbourne Zoo, the celebrant asked, will you take this woman to be your wife? Will you make the daily effort to relate to her? Frankly, if you met my cousin's wife, relating to her would be a daily effort. But for those of us growing up in the 60s and 70s, the evidence was there for all of us to see. Marriage, for us girls, did involve a great deal of work in the form of cutlet crumbing and ironing of shirts, the making of white sauce, vacuuming and deferring to one's husband. And the journey from sexy bride to matron frau seemed lamentably short. As my mother warned, love itself had to be worked at, and lasting love would require a real rolling up of one's sleeves. And as an American senator once said, You can't wring your hands and roll up your sleeves at the same time. The moralist in me will tell you that there is no mastery without discipline and work. That is true. But the romantic will tell you that I cannot write unless I'm in love. I've tried over the years to marry for money, mostly on television and film. I've tried to be a roll-up-your-sleeves kind of working girl. I wrote corporate training videos, education DVDs, episodes of this and that. I've written countless film scripts and rewritten them draft after draft until I wanted to bash my head on asphalt. I've had arranged marriages and ones where I've pitched my own stories. It's not as if my heart wasn't in it. I've always bled. But if you tango with television, know this: he is a brutal lover. Once we used to regard it as the work of prostitutes writing for money, but that was the 60s and 70s. We turned up our noses and called it selling out. Nobody thinks it anymore. Everybody knows that work is good. Work and work and work and work, lucky to have it. But don't mistake it for love. Love is a journey of the soul. If this long-term marriage I have between me and my PC, and we have produced 14 babies, if this relationship ever shows signs of being a dull and dragging thing, an obligation, a fraudulence, a codependent bickering of two old dogs on the same leash, and this has happened from time to time, then the first duty of any writer is to have an affair, to flirt with another genre. And for me, that is invariably writing about travel, the sexiest writing of all. It may not be the sexiest to read, but it certainly is the sexiest to write. Writing on a train, writing in a diary with a pen, writing what I see out a window, naming the colour of a wall, the personality of a house, the smell of a canal, the look of an elderly Greek, the angle of his cap. There's so much to express and understand, so much tantalising detail to depict. It's more vast than the universe itself. I am free. I am a mere passerby. What do I know of these lives that are being lived so far from Fitzroy? But here I am primed for adventure. Anything could happen, and everything or something does. Writing in the sexy embrace of a diary is like diving into the warm waters of the Aegean, or hiking up a French mountain where the air is cold and silent and laced with the citrus zing of the orange I'm peeling for my lunch. I am alive. I am fresh. I am embraced by solitude. I am in love. And like lovers the world over, this has never happened to anyone else before. But what happens to these words I write in diaries? Mostly they languish. Mostly they are gifts I have bought for myself. Dr. O says, planning to write is not writing. Outlining, researching, talking to people about what you're doing, none of that is writing. Writing is writing. When I first came across this declaration, I felt castigated and exposed. I call all of it writing. I bundle it all up and put it all on the tab. And I throw in walking and making soup and writing emails and reading, all in a day's work. But then I thought, hang on a minute, this is like sex. The actual time that you're engaged, hands-on, doing the business, From a look in the kitchen to lying spent, heart thumping in a tangle of bedding, the actual time taken has no bearing on the experience of making love, the significance of it, the centrality of it in one's life. Doctorow is a bean counter, a pedant. I denounce Doctorow. It's all or nothing. I'm also rather girlishly in love with being a writer. I'm in love with the mystery of it, the rebelliousness of it. When I was watching those movies with my mum, of course I wanted to be Julie Christie or Jane Fonda. I certainly wanted to be the kind of woman who came down into the kitchen the morning after wearing only my lover's oversized shirt. But writers can do that, and you don't have to be particularly pretty. What you must be is curious. A writer is an adventurous. My love affair is childish and profound, full of stings and jealousies, excitability and calm, tantrums and glittering happiness. I will work for a year for one exquisite insight which may never come. And this is what my mother failed to understand when she tried to stress that love had to be worked at. She underestimated me. I am as stubborn as a mountain. Love can never be labour. It can only be love. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bruno, for inviting me once again back to the West, where it all started for me, where my love of writing and reading came about. So I grew up, as some of you might know from my books, in two suburbs, Braybrook and Footscray, and I speak to a lot of secondary schools, and high school kids between the ages of 14 to 17 will never write about themselves. They'll write about vampires, they'll write about gangs in New York, and they'll write about taking drugs. They never write about themselves because they say, we don't have anything interesting to write about, miss. We grew up in two neighbourhoods. And when I was young and growing up in two neighbourhoods, I felt exactly as they did. When I was young, my mum's literature came in the mailbox. It came almost every day. At number 5 Joy Street in Braybrook, this was a little concrete house which my father looked in the Herald Sun one day and said, hey, Paul Keating's old house in the western suburbs of Sydney looks exactly like our house in Braybrook. So he was very proud to be living in his commission house. My mum was very happy every morning when she got her literature delivered, and the literature she read were the Safeway, the Bilo, the Coles, the Target and the Kmart ads, because my mother, she couldn't read and write very well in her first language. They closed down the Chinese schools in Cambodia when she was only in grade 2. So when she came to Australia, she was 8 months pregnant with me, and she had 3 other kids, so there are 4 of us. So every afternoon she would look through the Safeway and Bilo ads, and this was our way of reading the world, because in addition to that, besides the school readers that we got home every evening, we had 2 books in the house. One we got for free and one my father bought for me when I was about 8. So the one we got for free was the book of dangerous animals in Australia, and it was and we still have that. I know all the dangerous snakes and spiders in Australia. And the one that my father got for me was the Reader's Digest book of household hints and handy tips, published in 1988. And it had wonderful hints in there about how to carve a whale out of a watermelon and how to remove grass stains out of white trousers. And so these were the 2 pieces of literature that were constant in my childhood. And my father, though he had lofty aspirations, he named me Alice after Lewis Carroll's creation, Alice in Wonderland, because after surviving the killing fields in Cambodia, He thought that Australia was a wonderland, and people in Australia at the Midway Migrant Hostel were very generous and kind. So I named Alice after Lewis Carroll's Alice. And in the 1990s, and I know there's Linda from the library here, the library changed my life. It taught me to read the world in a very different way. When the Footscray Library opened in the 1990s, that was entirely and completely an Asian kid's social and dating life. So your parents, who would own the local grocery store or the Retrovision store in my father's case, or the takeaway shop, would say, go to the library, because the library was safe, it was well lit, it was clean, and Asian kids and books. So we'd go to the library, but we wouldn't be reading. We would be checking out the other kids who were sequestered in a library as well. So that formed my childhood. When I was 18 and I went to university, suddenly the world became much larger, and I studied subjects at university like political science and creative writing. And suddenly I realised that I could write about the West. And the reason I realised this was at university I sat down one afternoon, a lecturer took us out for coffee, and I realised a cup of coffee was $3.20 back then, and I'd never had a $3.20 cup of coffee. I thought it was outrageous when you could buy a whole tin of Nescafe at the Footscray Coles for $3.20. So it was a big culture shock. And then I realised this little microcosm I grew up in, this world called Footscray, this suburb called Braybrook, where we lived behind the carpet factories, was an entirely different world to Melbourne Law School. And so every holidays, while friends were getting clerkships at, Minter Allison's or Allen's Arthur Robinson law firms, my father would say, I'll give you some experience. You come and work at Retrovision. You come and look at our contracts. You help your auntie with her letter to the council about the trees growing in her backyard. And so that was my legal experience. I sold mobile phones at Retrovision. Now, back in the 90s, the late 90s, a mobile phone would take at least half an hour to connect. And we didn't want to lose customers to the local Optus store. So I would have to sit a customer down and say, can I make you a cup of Nescafe? And so I'd go around the back kitchen, mix up some Nescafe with sweetened condensed milk, and talk to the person who was connecting up their mobile phone. And that's how I learnt about the stories in the West. I grew up in this very strange shop where you could watch 20 televisions at the same time, where there used to be a gentleman who used to come in a wheelchair with a bit of tiger skin furry thing wrapped around him, and he used to buy speaker wire, 20 metres at the time, and we used to call him the speaker wire Tarzan. And there used to be another fellow from the funeral parlour who used to come in, and he used to buy 20 VHS tapes, and whole boxes of them at the same time, so we called him the funeral director taper. And these interesting characters in the West suddenly made it into these fictional stories I started writing at university, and people said, where do you come up with all these stories? And so I started to write about the West, and my mother recently was in the Footscray market, and she was haggling over 5 or 10 cents. This is the sort of world that I grew up in, and this is the sort of world that I go back to when I go back and visit my parents. And so one of my favourite poets, Professor Robert Cording from Holy Cross University in the States, said this about writing poetry. He said the poem doesn't or will not work if it feels like it has sifted and rearranged preconceived ideas. It has to feel as if it comes from a real human being, grappling with real human emotions and struggles, with no easy or immediate pithy resolution, but yet is not without some sense of meaning. And so these stories in the West that I wrote about, I also was very lucky that I knew nothing about high literature and I knew nothing about the Australian writing scene. I would send them to Women's Weekly. My pinnacle of success was Reader's Digest. I also sent them to some literary journals that my creative writing instructor told me to send them to, and eventually some of them started to get published, not in this pinnacle of great literature called the Reader's Digest, which I really wanted them to be in, but in a journal called Meanjin. And that's when the editor of Black Ink discovered me. He read one of my stories and said, "This is an interesting voice. Never heard that voice before." And so when my books are in high schools, some of them are, I feel so proud. I feel so, proud that the West is being studied as a sense of identity and belonging. When I go back to Footscray City Secondary College, even Springvale High School or Maribyrnong Secondary College, I realise that whole generations of kids who might feel displaced, and Braybrook was not the most positive place to grow up in the 1980s and 90s, during the worst recession, during a period of great upheaval, during the dislocation of technical colleges right next to our schools. And so the last school visits I did was Antonine College, which was a Lebanese school, and before that Ballarat, and then St Monica's in Eppings, and 4 girls' schools in Tasmania. And this is such a change from the first piece of literature or writing, not literature, but writing, that we ever studied about identity and belonging when I was in year 12 in 1997 or 98. We studied this maiden speech from an author and a politician before she was on Dancing with the Stars, Pauline Hanson. She said, they have their own culture and religion, they form ghettos and they don't assimilate. Now, writing Unpolished Gems, starting the very first story as a 19-year-old, the very first sentence, "This story does not begin on a boat," I had no idea that what I was writing was political, whether it was a slice of sense of community that no one had ever seen before, or whether it was an account of social and class hierarchies. It was just a story about growing up in Footscray. But looking back now, I'm so proud. I realise Unpolished Gem is set in a sort of ghetto that Pauline Hanson talks about, the ghetto of Footscray. And it is about a family with its own culture and religion trying to assimilate. At 19, I didn't fully understand the wider political context of my stories. In the 1990s, no one ever came to Footscray unless they had good reasons. Even in 2006, people who had read my book were emailing me and Facebooking me asking, you've opened my eyes to Footscray. I'd like to pay a visit there. Should I take a bum bag or a backpack in case someone snatches my bag from me? And now, wonderful things are happening. Epicure will profile Footscray Market. I led Hannie Rayson around Footscray for a wonderful afternoon. And people are moving to the west. It's the fastest growing demographic. And this is the most interesting thing, is that the most valuable pieces of real estate in Melbourne, Fitzroy, Carlton, Brunswick, Footscray, Yarraville, Richmond, are the places that used to be these ethnic ghettos Pauline Hanson really wanted eradicated. And I realised that I'm not only telling a story about being in the ghetto. These are human stories, and they're populated with human characters, not stories based on overriding themes or plots. And so, for me, learning about identity and place, and about politics and about class, has come as a result of writing. Thank you.
I genuinely love coming to this event. I afterwards, the next day, I just feel inspired because I think that somehow or other it keeps me absolutely in touch with people who are really trying to write lives, there's no bullshit about this, there's no pretense, it's all about, actually engaging with the stuff of life. And so I always feel like the wind in my sails after I've been to a rotunda.
Tonight's rotunda was so wonderful, and I'd like to thank Bruno for all his efforts in making it happen. Thanks.